Life is hard. Throughout our lives, we go through many challenges. Breakups, financial adversity, the loss of a loved one. But nothing will ever be quite as difficult as proper cable management.
That was terrible.
So, if you watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I'm not the best at cable management.
Oh my God!
And that's why I decided to start out the new year right by finally tackling the Gordian knot of cables underneath my desk, just like my namesake, but with fewer swords. But, much like the story of Alexander the Great, it is a tale that ends in tears. Because trying to redo all the cables underneath my desk absolutely broke me. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing some of the biggest mistakes I made when trying to manage the cables in my setup to hopefully spare you from some of the trouble I went through. Here are the top 5 mistakes to avoid when cable managing, starting with the least problematic and going up to the absolute worst one. At number 5, we have not labeling cables. Now, as far as mistakes go, not labeling the cables when you're cable managing isn't exactly the most egregious one you could make. After all, once your cables are neatly tucked away, you won't be looking at them pretty much ever. That's basically the whole point of cable management. But, of course, there is one time when you might need to look at them, and that's when you're removing or replacing something. And in those cases, being able to quickly pick out the exact cable you're looking for can save you a ton of hassle, guesswork, and have you avoid the possibility of pulling out the wrong one, which you'll then have to tuck away again before trying to find the right cable once more. In all honesty though, this still isn't that much of a big deal, but if you do have the opportunity to label your cables somehow, for example by color coordinating them in both ends, or using a cable holder with a tag you could write on, then you absolutely should do so, because it will save you some time in the end. Of course, you might not even have a need for labeling your cables unless you also made mistake number 4, which is not spacing things out. Look, when I first set out to redo all the cables underneath my desk, I had this vision of how it would turn out, and one major aspect of that vision was the idea of having everything in its own separate space. So for example, in this little cable tray up here, there'd be a neatly stacked bundle of audio cables from the speakers, then next to it, a nicely tied up bundle of power cords, and so on. And instead, I ended up with this. And aside from looking like the visual representation of an anxiety attack, there are actually 2 major issues with keeping all your cables bundled up in a mess like this. The first one is the obvious one. If you ever need to replace or remove one of these cables, you're going to have a hell of a hard time first locating it, then untangling it from all the other cables in order to successfully get it out in a way that doesn't pull apart everything else with it. But the second issue is actually a bit more serious, and one that you might not even know was a thing: cable interference. You see, if certain types of cables are bundled up too closely together, you might experience signal disruptions or distortions. Think of it as noise from one radio station bleeding into the signal from another station when you're listening to the radio. Because apparently this is 1987. Anyway, most cables nowadays have pretty decent insulation to prevent cable interference from happening, so unless you're using something like a really cheap HDMI or DisplayPort cable, you're probably never going to experience this at all. Except in one case: audio cables. Putting the cables from your speaker too close to a power cable is a well-known cause of interference and could result in you hearing a low humming noise coming from your speakers. I actually had this exact thing happen to me in this setup before I redid all the cables, and while the hum wasn't super loud when I was listening to stuff, it was definitely pretty noticeable when no sound was playing, to the point where I eventually stopped using them altogether. So depending on your space and how your desk is set up, try your best to space things out, but at the very least, just make sure your audio cables are nowhere near your power cables. Mistake number 3 is buying the wrong things, and I think it's pretty obvious why this one is a mistake. It's just a complete waste of money. Look, when I first came up with the idea to revamp my cable management, I sat down and planned out exactly what things I would need. How many plugs, how many cable ties, all of it. And yet, by the end of me actually putting together my setup, I was left with 2 packs of cable ties completely unused, 1 USB-C dock completely unused, and out of these enormous bags of cable holders totaling about 50 all in all, I used 2. So obviously that's just money down the drain that I could have used on something else, like a down payment on a ridiculously overpriced desk mat from GroveMade. But worse than that is also the fact that not only did I buy the wrong things, but I also committed mistake number 2, which is not buying the right things. And yeah, maybe you'd think these go hand in hand, but there is a difference. You see, if you buy the wrong things, you might end up wasting your money unless you're lucky enough to be able to return some of those items. But if you don't buy the right things and you don't find out until you're in the middle of your cable management setup, then you're left with 2 choices. Either stop what you're doing until you can go out and buy what you need, or change your plans to make do with what you have on hand. I somehow ended up doing both of these during my attempt at cable management, and it was not a good experience. First off, having to stop right in the middle of everything so you can go out and buy some plugs, which is what I had to do, can really throw you off your game and make the whole project drag on for a lot longer than what you had anticipated. I actually thought, maybe stupidly, that I could manage to do everything in a couple of hours, but in between having to stop several times because of me not having bought the right things, as well as trying to film everything I was doing, it ended up taking an entire day. And then dragged on even longer than that due to the worst mistake I made, which I'll get to in a minute. But then, the second part of not buying the right things in advance is that you may end up having to take some shortcuts, like having to strap an older USB-C hub to the underside of your cable tray because you need the additional ports and you have nowhere else to put it. Or trying to squeeze a second power strip in between your cables and daisy chaining it to the first one because you miscounted the number of plugs you'd need. Or sticking a USB hub to the side of the table because you ran out of USB extension cords and this was the only way your cable could reach it. So now your attempt at proper cable management has cables literally sticking out the sides of your damn table. So yeah, not great. But the worst mistake I made by far, and the one that ultimately ended up breaking me, was mistake number 1, not testing out the cables. So picture this. It's 10 p.m. and you've just spent the entire day on cable management for your setup. You've had numerous setbacks along the way, but finally, after hours and hours of hard work, it's all done. So you sit down to turn your computer on, and then you notice one thing isn't working. And then another. And another. In fact, half the stuff you connected isn't working properly, meaning you now have 2 options. Spend several hours more trying to problem solve and fix these issues, or start all over again tomorrow. Now, it may seem like a bit of an overreaction to you to hear that this broke me, but when you couple everything I just said with the fact that I had been putting it off for weeks because it was such a big project, and then now having finally done it and failed at it, it had left me in a state where I would also be able to work on my YouTube channel before I had it fixed. Hence why I haven't posted anything in about a month. So yeah, that really sucked. Now, to be more specific, when I first booted up my computer after redoing all of the cables, here's a list of things that no longer worked. The secondary display, the keyboard and mouse, the microphone, the teleprompter, the webcam, and all of the audio. Needless to say, that's a pretty sizable portion of my setup that was now no longer functioning at all, so of course I had to spend forever trying to fix all of these issues, all of which could have been avoided if I just tested out the cables every time I added something new. You see, I'd already had the computer hooked up as one of the first things, and then I did the monitors afterwards, so it would have been the easiest thing in the world to boot it up every now and then to see what worked and what didn't. Keep in mind, throughout all of this, I had to make several compromises to my original vision, including using older cables and hubs I had laying around, and connecting things in a way I hadn't planned on, so it was only natural that certain things wouldn't work. For example, I couldn't use the original DisplayPort cable I had for my secondary monitor because it was too short, so I used a different one. Turns out that one didn't work so well, although only in certain cases, which made it even harder to figure out what was wrong. Also, the USB hub I connected to my teleprompter couldn't draw enough current to power it, which then also caused my microphone to turn off. These are all things I could have figured out very quickly if I just tested out the cables while putting it all together. But instead, I had to spend hours troubleshooting, redoing even more cables, and coming up with even more patchwork fixes after the fact, which ended up also making the whole thing a lot messier as well. Which kind of defeats the purpose of why I was doing cable management in the first place. So, all in all, I wouldn't say this project was a complete failure, but only because I actually managed to learn a few things from it. Number one being that I was right the first time. I do suck at cable management.
You're goddamn right.
Anyway, if you're curious about the stack monitor setup I'm rocking and whether that would be good for you, I got a whole video on that right here. Remember to like the video and subscribe for more tech and desk setup related content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.